Massachusetts is known for its colonial history, but its deeper past is filled with strange carvings, lost settlements, and puzzling stone structures that don't fit neatly into the record. From unexplained petroglyphs to ancient marks hidden in quiet towns, the state holds mysteries that raise more questions than answers. Let's explore the most intriguing ones. The Wachusett Mountain Stone Circles. When people think of Wachusett Mountain, they picture ski slopes, leaf-peeping crowds, and a summit that gives you one of the cleanest views in central Massachusetts. But if you head off the main trails, really off into the quieter folds of the forest, you start noticing things that don't show up on any official map. Low rings of stones, half-buried arcs, shapes in the ground that don't make sense if you're expecting just another New England hillside. These formations are usually small enough that you could walk right past them without realizing they're there. But once you spot one, it's almost like the forest teaches you a new language. You start seeing more. A ring at the edge of a clearing, a half circle tucked under a fallen pine, a shape that shouldn't be there, but somehow is. That's the mystery of the Wachusett Mountain Stone Circles. They're everywhere and nowhere at once, obvious when you know what to look for, invisible when you don't. Most people don't notice them at all. Wachusett isn't marketed as a site of ancient structures or mysterious earthworks. The park focuses on recreation, trails, wildlife, skiing, picnicking, but hikers who stray from the main loops keep reporting the same thing, these quiet rings of stones that look deliberate, not dramatic, not towering, but intentional. And intentional is where the questions begin. One reason the circles draw attention is that Wachusett Mountain has deep indigenous significance. Long before Europeans arrived, this mountain served as a landmark, a lookout, and a spiritual center for the Nipmuc people. Its name reflects that connection. This wasn't just another hill. This was a place where the land reached up toward the sky in a way that shaped stories, ceremonies, and seasonal rhythms. When you look at the mountain through that lens, the idea of stone circles starts to feel possible. Many indigenous groups across North America used rocks to mark significant places, ceremonial spots, astronomical points, burial locations or boundaries. And even though New England's indigenous traditions use stone differently compared to other regions, there's no rule saying they couldn't have built circles here, especially in a place as important as Wachusett. But there's a catch. Archaeologists haven't formally studied these circles. No digs, no surveys, no official research. That doesn't mean the circles aren't interesting. It just means we're left with an open question, and open questions tend to invite theories. One theory says the circles come from early settlers or farmers. Maybe these were remains of old charcoal pits used during the early iron industry. Charcoal burning was common in the region in the 1700s and 1800s, and the process sometimes left ring-shaped depressions lined with stones. But charcoal pits usually have a very specific structure. Large, deep, evenly spaced. They don't match the scattered, irregular little rings found on Wachusett's slopes. Another theory says the circles might be boundary markers, laid by surveyors or landowners before the mountain was turned into a reservation. But that explanation also gets messy. Boundaries were usually marked by big, unmistakable stones or blazes on trees, not subtle rings hidden under leaves where nobody would notice them. You don't create something that delicate if your goal is simply to say, "This is my land." Then there's the geological explanation. Maybe these stones were left behind by glaciers thousands of years ago. Glacial deposits are everywhere in Massachusetts, but glaciers don't organize rocks into neat rings or arcs. They dump things haphazardly. Boulders here, gravel there, whatever the ice carried at the time. Nature can create surprising shapes, but circles this consistent across multiple locations are hard to chalk up to pure chance. What makes the mystery stronger is that early surveyors, long before modern hikers brought phones and GPS, noticed the circles too. In the early 1900s, when the state was still figuring out how much land would become part of the Wachusett Reservation, survey teams mentioned curious circular stone patterns on the slopes. They didn't explain them, they didn't investigate. They just made a note and kept moving. These were practical workers. If the circles had looked like charcoal pits, they would have said so. If they'd thought the circles were trash or random stones, they wouldn't have bothered mentioning them at all. Another layer of the mystery comes from a few older local stories, more fragments than full accounts. Long before the mountain became a recreation site, farmers and woodcutters talked about odd rings in the woods. Some said the circles marked old campsites. Some said they were older than that. A few claimed they were Indian signs, though that phrase was used loosely in the 1800s and often referred to anything mysterious or ancient without any cultural accuracy. Still, the fact that people noticed these circles more than 100 years ago tells us they aren't a new phenomenon. Walk through the forest today, and the circles still catch the eye. Most are only a foot or two across, formed by small stones, nothing dramatic, but others stretch wider, maybe 6 or 7 feet across, with thicker stones that look like they were placed with effort. Some circles sit perfectly level on flat forest patches, while others tilt with the slope, suggesting whoever built them took advantage of the natural terrain. One detail hikers often point out is how quiet these circles feel. Step inside one and the forest seems to settle. Even if it's just the wind or the acoustics of the trees, it's noticeable. People often describe a stillness, almost like stepping into a different pocket of air. That's not evidence, of course, but it is a common experience. Enough people mention it that it becomes part of the mystery. Another interesting point is alignment. Some circles seem to face sunrise or sunset points during the solstices. A few line up with breaks in the tree line. They're not perfect alignments, not the kind that make headlines or create grand theories, but they're consistent enough that you wonder whether they were placed with some awareness of the sky. One of the most intriguing ideas is that the circles could have been part of a larger landscape pattern. Indigenous stone structures in New England often blend so naturally into the land that you don't realize how many there are until you start connecting them. Chambers, walls, terraces, cairns, none of them stand out like Western-style ruins, but together they form patterns that could have carried ceremonial meaning. If the Wachusett circles were part of such a pattern, then the mystery isn't just the circles themselves, but the invisible network they might belong to. But because no one has studied them closely, the circles sit in this strange limbo. They're not confirmed as indigenous, not confirmed as colonial, not confirmed as geological. They're simply there, quiet, patient, slowly sinking deeper into the forest floor with every passing season. Whenever the state performs trail maintenance or erosion control, workers mostly avoid disturbing the deeper forest floor, which means the circles remain untouched, not out of mystery but simply out of policy. Standing among them, you get the sense of how old the mountain really is. Wachusett isn't just a pretty hill with a ski lift. It's a place where glaciers carved the bedrock, where indigenous families traveled and gathered, where early colonists fought the land and each other, where farmers cleared fields that later grew wild again. The mountain has seen every version of New England that's ever existed. The circles feel like part of that long memory, something old that persists even when nobody's watching. On a personal level, what strikes me about these stone circles is how understated they are. They're not built to impress. They don't announce themselves. You find them only when you slow down, leave the main trails, and pay attention to the ground. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the circles were always meant to blend into the land, serving a purpose that didn't require size or spectacle, just presence. I don't think the circles are random. There are too many of them, arranged too consistently, noted in documents too old to dismiss. My feeling is that they're probably indigenous in origin, or at least shaped by indigenous hands even if they began as natural formations. Maybe they marked seasonal gatherings. Maybe they outlined small sacred spaces. Maybe they served as guide points along trails that have long since disappeared. Or maybe they were something simpler, quiet symbols rooted in the day-to-day life of people who understood this mountain better than we ever will. Today, the circles remain one of Wachusett's softest mysteries. No signs, no plaques, no brochures, just patches of old stone waiting under the leaves. They don't demand an explanation, but they certainly invite one. And if you walk the mountain long enough, you start feeling that pull. The circles are still there, still holding their shape, still keeping whatever story they once carried. And maybe that's part of the beauty. Not everything ancient has to be discovered, documented, or decoded. Some things are meant to be felt. Wachusett Mountain carries that kind of energy, the kind where history sits quietly, half buried, waiting for anyone curious enough to pause and listen. The ancient fort on Castle Island. When you walk along the shoreline of Castle Island today, it's easy to picture it as nothing more than a peaceful stretch of waterfront, with a clean, open view of Boston Harbor. The breeze is steady, the gulls drift overhead, and Fort Independence stands there with its sharp geometric walls, solid and familiar, but stories about this place run deeper than its stone shell. Beneath the clean lines and grassy slopes lies a puzzle that people have been arguing about for more than 2 centuries. What exactly stood here before the fort we see now? And how far back did human activity on this little island really go? Most visitors only know Castle Island for its later military history. They see it as an 1800s fortress with a scenic walkway around it. But older documents and scattered archaeological findings paint a much stranger picture, hints of buried walls, uneven foundations that don't match the fort's plans, and heavy stones unearthed long before modern restoration work. For decades, these clues have fed a quiet belief that something older once occupied this spot, something built long before the English arrived. The earliest European settlers wrote about a small structure already here when they first claimed the island in the 1630s. It was described in vague terms, almost as if they weren't sure what to call it. Some notes say it looked like an old work, something defensive but unfamiliar. Early colonial writers didn't spend much time on it, but the fact that they mentioned it at all raises questions. If it wasn't their construction, then who built it, and how old was it? That question sat unanswered for generations. Over time, the colonial fort was rebuilt again and again. Each new version grew heavier, more geometric, more suited to the canons of its era. But every rebuild also meant more digging, more foundations torn up, and more moments where workers stumbled across stones they didn't expect. There are old letters from engineers describing odd layers of material, thick stone blocks that didn't match their plans, or underground channels whose purpose they couldn't identify. These letters were never written for the public. They were internal notes, the kind of thing you jot down quickly but never follow up on. One detail that keeps surfacing is the presence of a stone platform beneath the later foundations. Workers described it as unusually dense, carefully shaped, and sitting at an angle that didn't line up with any known colonial layout. That's the moment when you start to wonder, was there a pre-colonial fortification here, something older than anything documented, or was this simply a practical base built by early English settlers and then forgotten as newer construction buried it? The answer isn't simple, because Castle Island has changed shape over time. The cape and seafloor surrounding it were reshaped by erosion, storms, and landfills pushed outward as Boston expanded. The island we see today isn't the island that existed 400 years ago. That complicates things. If something ancient stood on a shoreline that no longer exists, or if pieces of it were dragged away during early construction, then the physical proof is scattered, sometimes literally. Still, there's a stubborn piece of the puzzle that keeps researchers coming back: the idea that indigenous groups may have used Castle Island long before Europeans arrived, possibly as a defensive lookout point. Its position provides a striking view of the harbor's entrance. You can see everything coming your way: canoes, ships, storms rolling in. For any community relying on the water, this spot would have been invaluable. If there was an earlier structure here, it might have served a purpose that blended ceremony and practicality, something that doesn't fit neatly into English ideas of a fort. When archaeologists have taken soil samples from the area around the fort, they've found layers that don't match the timeline of English settlement. Mixed in with colonial artifacts, there are older flakes of stone and scattered fragments that point toward earlier activity. They're not dramatic finds, not the kind that make headlines, but they add weight to the idea that Castle Island was far from empty when Europeans arrived. There's also the odd story of an early ship captain who noted seeing unusual stonework on the island while passing by in the 1620s, before there was any official English presence here. His report claimed the stones looked shaped and placed rather than scattered by nature. The details are brief, almost frustratingly vague, but the timing makes it intriguing. If that sighting was accurate, someone built something here before the English arrived in the region. And then there's the strangest part: rumors of an underground chamber discovered during an 1800s reconstruction. The description reads almost like a room carved into the base of the island, deeper than anything the colonial fort builders needed. According to letters, the chamber was empty except for soil, shells, and water-worn stone. Some speculated it was a natural cavity. Others insisted it looked man-made because of the shape of the entrance. Whatever it was quickly overshadowed by the construction above it, and no serious attempt was made to study it. The workers filled it in and moved on. If you stand at the edge of the island today and look out at the harbor, it's easy to feel how much has shifted over centuries. Land that was once exposed is now underwater. Areas that were swampy and low have been filled in and raised. With all those changes, the idea of an older fortification isn't impossible. It's just buried under layers of earth, stone, and time. The problem is that any remaining pieces are likely trapped beneath or inside the base of Fort Independence, making them inaccessible without major excavation, and that's why the mystery lingers. There's a sense that if someone were to peel back the walls of the fort and trace its foundations from the inside out, they might find more clues. Stone blocks shaped by unknown hands, remnants of earlier walls, maybe even a different layout entirely. It's the kind of discovery that could rewrite a tiny corner of New England history. But Fort Independence is historic in its own right, and tearing it apart to search for something older simply isn't an option. So the unanswered questions remain. Was there a much earlier structure here? Did indigenous groups shape something into the land that colonial builders later buried without understanding? Was the strange stonework noted by early observers part of a defensive lookout, a ceremonial space, or something completely different? Or did later workers misinterpret what they found, mixing practical early colonial construction with the kind of rumor that grows over time? Walking here today, the area feels calm. Families wander by with ice cream, kids run along the pathway, and the water sits in a soft, rhythmic pulse. That's the surface. Underneath it, the island holds its quieter story, one that doesn't shout for attention but doesn't fade either. It's easy to forget that every stone and every slope here is the product of countless rebuilds, storms, and hands that once shaped it for reasons we may never fully understand. My own take, after spending time here and reading through the scraps of surviving notes, is that something older probably did exist on this island. Maybe not a full fortress, but certainly a structure or platform important enough to survive into the earliest days of English settlement. And maybe it's better that it stays a little mysterious. Castle Island feels like a place where the past sits just out of reach, close enough to sense but not close enough to hold. It gives the place a quiet tension, a feeling that the more you try to pin it down, the more the story slips away. The Dighton Rock Petroglyphs. If you've ever stood in front of Dighton Rock, you know the feeling comes before the meaning. The first thing that hits you is how strange the stone looks. This massive, dark boulder covered in scratches, lines, symbols, faces, and shapes that don't line up with anything familiar. It sits behind glass now, protected inside a small museum near the Taunton River. But for most of its life, this rock sat partly submerged in the mud at the edge of the water, catching the tide twice a day, slowly gathering layer after layer of mystery. Dighton Rock is about 11 feet long, 5 feet high, and covered on one face with carvings that seem both deliberate and chaotic at the same time. Stand close enough, and your eyes keep jumping from one shape to another. Arrows, spirals, faces, geometric patterns, maybe even letters if your imagination leans that way. And that's the thing about this rock. Whatever you're expecting to see, you'll find some version of it on the surface. It's like a mirror for theories. The earliest written accounts of Dighton Rock go back to the 1600s. Early colonists didn't know what to make of the markings, so they did what people usually do when they're confused. They wrote it down and left plenty of room for future arguments. Over the centuries, the rock has been claimed by indigenous historians, Portuguese explorers, Viking enthusiasts, colonial scholars, and just about every early contact theory you can think of. Everyone sees something different, and none of the interpretations agree with each other. The most widely supported explanation, at least among archaeologists, is that the carvings were made by indigenous people long before Europeans arrived. Many local tribes, especially the Wampanoag, used petroglyphs to mark important places, record events, or leave spiritual symbols tied to the land. The Taunton River was a natural travel route. A rock of this size near a tidal crossing would have been meaningful, so the idea of indigenous origin fits. It makes sense, it's grounded, but the carvings don't match anything else in the region perfectly. There are similarities to other Algonquian designs, but nothing that creates a clean translation. The surface is too busy, too layered, too weathered by centuries of river tides. Even indigenous historians today say the rock's symbols feel older than the oldest living stories about the area. That ambiguity opened the door for other theories, some reasonable, some dramatic, and some that feel like the kind of thing you get when people really want a mystery to go their way. One of the most persistent early theories claimed that the carvings were made by ancient Phoenicians or Carthaginians who somehow crossed the Atlantic. That idea came from 18th century scholars who believed the rock showed Mediterranean-style characters. Today we know this theory doesn't hold up. There's no evidence of ancient Middle Eastern sailors landing in New England, but it's part of the rock's long history of attracting big imaginations. Then there's the Viking theory. In the 1800s, a Danish historian insisted the markings proved Norse explorers reached Massachusetts. He believed the rock showed Viking names, Viking symbols, even Viking initials. This theory still floats around online because people love the idea of Norse explorers leaving graffiti across the East Coast. But again, archaeologists haven't found a single Viking artifact anywhere near Dighton Rock. No tools, no structures, nothing. The theory is entertaining, but it rests on wishful thinking. The most politically charged theory came from the Portuguese side. In the early 1900s, some historians from Portugal argued that the carvings represented a record left by Miguel Corte Real, a Portuguese explorer who disappeared in 1502. They believed he reached Massachusetts and carved his coat of arms into the rock. Portugal even embraced the theory as part of national pride for a while, but it never had solid evidence behind it, and later scholars pointed out that almost all the letters and shields people claimed to see on the rock were products of selective imagination. And this is the real challenge with Dighton Rock. It's covered in overlapping lines. Once someone points out a shape, you start seeing it even if it's not actually there. It's the same way people find constellations in random stars. Your brain connects lines because it wants meaning, but the rock doesn't give up meaning easily. What makes the carvings so confusing is that they look like they were made at different times. Some lines cut over others. Some symbols look shallow and worn, while others look sharper, as if carved later. It's possible the rock isn't one message, it's dozens, layered across centuries. Hunters might have added marks. Travelers might have left their own symbols. Generations could have treated the rock as a place to leave a piece of themselves. If you think of it that way, it becomes less like a single inscription, and more like a graffiti wall that lived for hundreds of years. There's also the environment to consider. The rock sat in tidal mud for most of its history. Water and silt scraped its surface every day. Ice expanded and cracked the softer areas each winter. So even if the original carvings were clear, time reshaped them into something more abstract. What we see now might be a blurred version of what once existed. What adds to the mystery is how early colonial writers described the rock. Some of their drawings show details that don't appear on the rock today. Were those details real and later worn away? Or did the colonists sketch what they thought they saw, adding their own interpretations? We'll never know for sure, but those old drawings complicate the timeline. The rock was already ancient when Europeans first looked at it, but it was also already confusing. There's a quiet moment that tends to hit people when they see Dighton Rock in person. You stand there staring at these shapes, and you realize the carvings were made by someone whose intentions didn't survive the centuries. The rock stayed, but the story didn't. The gap between those two facts is where the mystery sits, and personally, that's what I find powerful about it. This isn't a mystery built on fantasy. It's a real artifact with real carvings made by human hands. Whoever carved it lived a life we can't picture, in a landscape that looked totally different. They stood where the museum sits now. They looked out at water that rose and fell in a rhythm older than any nation. They carved something they meant to remember or celebrate or teach. Even if the meaning is lost, the act itself feels human. You can almost picture someone leaning over the rock with a sharpened stone, shaping lines that would outlive them by centuries. There's something grounding in that, something that cuts through the noise of all the theories. Today, Dighton Rock has a different kind of quiet energy. The museum isn't big, and it isn't crowded. You open the door, step inside, and there it is, this dark boulder behind glass, still carrying its questions. The room feels more like a shrine than an exhibit. You stand there, the river only a few steps outside, and you get the sense that you're looking at one of the oldest conversation starters in North America. Some mysteries try to give you chills. Dighton Rock doesn't do that. It gives you curiosity instead. It draws you in and reminds you that not everything old fits neatly into the stories we expect. My own view is simple. The carvings are almost certainly indigenous in origin. That's where the cultural context, the geography, and the patterns point. But I also think the rock carried meaning across generations. Layered meaning, shifting meaning. Maybe it began as a record of something sacred. Maybe later groups added their own marks. Maybe this was once a gathering point, a place where travelers paused before crossing the river. The truth doesn't have to be dramatic to be fascinating. What matters is that the rock survived, the carvings survived, the mystery survived, and even now in a small building in Massachusetts, Dighton Rock keeps doing what it's always done. It waits for someone new to stand in front of it and wonder. The Fall River Devil's Footprint. The story of the Fall River Devil's Footprint is one of those small but stubborn legends that clings to a place long after the original details have faded. You hear about it from locals, tucked between stories about the Lizzie Borden house and the old factories that line the river. It almost feels like something people aren't sure they believe, but they also aren't quite willing to dismiss. And when you stand in front of the stone itself, with that odd little impression carved into granite, you understand why. It's not large, it's not dramatic, but it's strange enough that you keep coming back to the same question. Who put it here, and what were they trying to say? The footprint sits near St. Mary's Cathedral in Fall River, not too far from the bustle of downtown. Today the area feels ordinary, surrounded by schools, houses, and people going about their day. But if you rewind a couple centuries, this patch of land looked very different. Before the mills, before the churches, before the city even had a name, the Wampanoag people lived here. They used the rocky landscape for travel, ceremony, and hunting. When European settlers arrived, they built over much of what was here, but they also found odd stones and markings they couldn't explain. One of those was the footprint. The earliest written record of the stone dates back to the late 1600s. According to old accounts, the settlers believed the strange mark was left during a fight between a local minister and the devil himself. The minister, Reverend Samuel Torrey, or one of his contemporaries depending on the version, was said to have been praying or preaching when the devil appeared. The two battled on the rocky ground, and the devil stamped his foot hard enough to leave an impression in the granite. That story spread because it gave the early community a sense of spiritual identity. It made Fall River feel like a battleground between good and evil. And like all good folklore, it stuck. But if you look at the actual stone, the story gets more complicated. The footprint doesn't look like a cloven hoof. It looks more human, maybe a little exaggerated, but definitely carved with intention by someone who understood the shape of a foot. The toes are rounded, the arch is visible, the whole thing has a style that feels more like an artistic carving than a supernatural scorch mark. So the first big mystery is obvious. Who carved it? Some researchers think the footprint might be a Native American marker. Footprint carvings appear in other parts of New England, usually connected to paths, boundaries, or spiritual sites. They weren't meant to be literal footprints in the sense of belonging to a specific person. Instead, they often symbolized presence, direction, protection, or connection to ancestors. In that context, the Fall River footprint might have been created long before Europeans arrived, and the devil story was simply the settlers' attempt to explain something they didn't understand. Other historians lean toward the idea that an early colonial stonecutter carved it as a sort of signature or oddity. Back then, skilled workers often left personal marks on quarries or building stones. The style of the carving could line up with that kind of tradition. But the problem is that no one has ever found a matching signature or toolmark style from a known stonecutter in the area. The footprint stands alone. There's also the theory that it was carved as a warning. Early colonial conflicts with indigenous groups were frequent, and markings on the landscape sometimes served as signs to keep travelers away from sacred or restricted land. A footprint could signal that someone powerful had walked here, or that the land belonged to a particular group. It isn't impossible that early colonists misunderstood the meaning and built a supernatural story around it. Standing in front of the stone today, it's hard not to notice the smoothness of it. People have touched it for generations. Kids have climbed on it. Visitors have taken photos. The carving has worn down, but not enough to lose its shape. You get this quiet feeling that the stone has been watching the city change for hundreds of years, while remaining exactly where it is. That sense of durability is part of what makes the legend feel grounded, even if the details are hazy. Local stories add layers to the mystery. Some residents say that animals avoid the stone. Others claim that if you stand near it at night, the air feels heavier. A few people even insist the footprint occasionally gathers water in a way that doesn't match the weather. These are the kinds of small observations that don't make headlines but stick in the mind of anyone who lives nearby. Whether they're exaggerations or misinterpretations doesn't really matter. They help keep the story alive. There's also the way the footprint sits so close to St. Mary's Cathedral. The church wasn't there when the stone was carved, but the contrast today is striking. You have this massive granite church rising above the hill, and right beside it, a small footprint in a natural boulder that predates everything around it. One structure represents an institution that shaped the city. The other represents something older, more elusive, and harder to interpret. Together, they create a strange balance. It almost feels like the footprint is reminding you that no matter how many buildings go up, the land itself still has history that can't be erased. One question that always comes up is why the footprint survived while so many other carvings and stones disappeared under roads and construction. Some people say the church protected it, intentionally or not. Others believe the stone was simply too big and too close to important property to be moved. But there's also the idea that local residents didn't want to lose it. Even in the 1800s, people treated the footprint as something worth preserving. They didn't know exactly what it meant, but they sensed that it mattered. When you talk to Fall River locals, you notice that the footprint rarely comes up as a standalone legend. It's usually folded into a larger story about the city's history. Fall River has always been a place where folklore mixes with real events. From millworker tales to family superstitions, the community carries stories in a way that feels casual and personal. The devil's footprint fits nicely into that pattern. It's a little strange, a little funny, and a little unsettling, and that combination keeps it from fading into obscurity. Today, the footprint is easy to visit. It sits outdoors, unprotected, not behind glass or ropes. That accessibility makes the mystery feel more intimate. You don't read about it in a museum plaque. You see it the way people have seen it for centuries, in the open, part of the landscape, waiting for you to interpret it. You can run your hand over the carving and feel the groove left by some long-ago tool, and whether you think it was a Native American artist, a colonial prankster, or something else entirely, the fact remains that someone stood right here and intentionally shaped this mark. That simple truth is often more powerful than the supernatural stories layered on top. My own impression of the site is that the footprint feels older than the city around it, but not ancient in a mythical sense. It has the look of deliberate craftsmanship, like someone left it with a specific purpose in mind, even if that purpose has been lost. At the same time, the legend adds a charm that the raw carving alone wouldn't have. The idea that the devil himself stomped this into granite is obviously not literal, but it shows how communities develop meaning when the original context is missing. The folklore becomes part of the artifact. As the city continues to grow and change, the footprint remains a quiet reminder that not everything in a landscape can be fully explained. Sometimes a carved stone tells you more about the people who passed its story along than about the person who created it. That's what makes the Fall River Devil's footprint so compelling. It's simple, mysterious, and oddly resilient, and like any good mystery, it invites you to take one more look, touch the surface, and wonder who walked here first.